The following program is made possible in part by the Dayton Bar Association.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Swillinger. I'm the host and producer for tonight's show of You and the Law. We're happy to have you. This is our maiden voyage on Zoom. This is a bit new to me, but we'll do our best. We may have some technical difficulties, probably occasioned by my efforts or lack thereof, but we have a wonderful guest, Debra Lavey. She is with Law and Able. She'll tell you a little bit more about what that means in a moment. We've been fortunate to have Deb the last 2 years kind of kick off our season for some health reasons unrelated to anyone here, starting a little bit later this year, but we'll catch up with shows. And I just want to say a special thank you to the staff at DATV for making this possible. They've worked with me and explained to me what we need to do here to take this live. The show will be streaming. You'll be able to call in, but I will not hear your voice over the phone. The summary of your questions will be sent to me on group chat, and then I will kind of read them back, and we'll give Deb an opportunity to respond, and maybe we'll have some discussion depending on the nature of the questions. I want to remind you that the phone number is 223-5311, 223-5311. The show is brought to you by DATV and underwritten by the Dayton Bar Association. I would recommend that if you have legal issues arising out of questions that have come on this come forth on this show, or just unrelated ones, that the Dayton Bar Association is available through their lawyer referral program to help you find a lawyer, and you can read more about that on the Dayton Bar Association's website. The phone number there also is 937-222-7902. And with that, I want to move right into this. We have a very important topic tonight that we're calling COVID and the eviction crisis. Debra Lavey, again, is our guest. I'll turn this over to her in just a moment. I will say that tonight's program is going to be a bit different. The last couple years I've had Deb on, and we have tried to address some core issues for landlords and tenants when they enter into lease agreements, particularly the residential type as opposed to commercial leases, and the issues that may arise in the course of their doing so, and what remedies might be available if either side feels as though they've possibly been the victim of some misconduct by the other party. Tonight's a whole different ball of wax for the most part. Tonight is responding to the COVID crisis and how this has impacted upon us all in one way or another over the last approximately 7 to 9 months. And Deb has been right in the thick of this throughout. And so with that in mind, Deb, I'm going to turn to you and say welcome again. It's always a pleasure to have you. You're an outstanding attorney and outstanding person. And I'd like you to give us a little bit of your background briefly, and then let's get right into this and talk about where we were before COVID briefly, and what COVID brought on, and where we are, and we'll talk about specific issues along the way. So with that in mind, thank you.
So thank you, Jeff, so much for having me on this program. It's a pleasure to be back.
What's your name?
My name is Debra Lavey. I'm an attorney with Advocates for Basic Legal Equality. We provide free legal services to low-income individuals and seniors. I work out of our Dayton office, and we have many offices throughout our 32 county service area, as far south as Dayton, as far north as Toledo. So it's a pleasure to be here. Uh, the last time I was here, we talked a lot about tenant rights and obligations and landlord right and obligations. We talked somewhat about evictions, but as you so appropriately mentioned, we are in an eviction crisis, and we were in an eviction crisis before COVID-19 hit. But this pandemic surely has made things a lot worse in regards to evictions. So it's good to be here to talk about all the things that have happened related to evictions since the pandemic hit us this year.
Well, it's really good to have you and with your expertise responding to daily kinds of issues that are just incredible. As I prepared for tonight, and it was like it was like drawing a map in a sense, because I would write down one point and I'd say, well, that leads to this and this leads to that, and it's a pebble in the pond. We can compare it to so many little things, but this is a big thing. And so we get to the beginning of the year, the crisis hits. It hits worldwide. It's hit us nationwide in large numbers and continues to do so. This show is apolitical, so I don't want to, and I know you don't want to get into anything of that nature. Let's just talk about how this first impacted our greater Dayton community, what your role has been, the role of your colleagues who are working on these same issues, people you've worked with in the community and continue to work with, some of the programs that are nationwide, some that are local funding sources in particular. Why don't we just start back at the beginning of the year and what, obviously there were eviction issues, as you said earlier or a moment ago, that had pre-existed COVID, but now they've been terribly exacerbated. And for both landlords and tenants, and for lenders and for utility providers and a host of folks that one doesn't even think of at first when you first think about the issue of landlords and tenants, but then it just spreads right out, right?
Yeah, that's right. So let's go back. Everyone come back with me in March of this year, which seems like, quite frankly, years ago, when we saw on the news that COVID had arrived, and quite frankly, discover later they'd been here for some time. And courts were really struggling with what to do with their cases. And what we saw in relation to evictions is we saw courts slowly suspending hearings on evictions. We still saw tenants being moved out that had been evicted. But for the most part, by April, many courts in our service area had stopped hearing eviction cases. What that meant is it kept tenants in their homes during, the beginning of the crisis as we know it. But unfortunately, what we saw at Legal Aid is that many landlords were frustrated by that. And we saw an increase of what we would call self-help evictions, where landlords who couldn't go to court and get tenants out, they were changing locks and shutting off utilities if they could. Many utility companies had suspended shutoffs, but if landlords could do it on their own, some were doing that. And we were seeing an increase in that. At the end of March, President Trump signed into law the CARES Act. Many have heard that term. It's pretty commonplace now, March 27th, 2020. And a piece of that act provided protection for tenants that reside in either public housing, that's housing owned and operated by a local public housing authority. Here in Dayton, that's Greater Dayton Premier Management, or subsidized housing, housing that tenants reside in where they receive some sort of government subsidy, either through housing and urban development, rural development, the tax credit program, any of those programs. And under the Act provided for a 120-day eviction moratorium. So what that meant is if you were a tenant and you resided in one of those places, you couldn't be evicted for 120 days for non-payment of rent.
Let me just interrupt you. Along the way, please talk about the difference between a moratorium on rent payment and forgiveness and the difference.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point, Jeff. So the CARES Act provided for a moratorium. That meant that a landlord couldn't issue an eviction notice or file an eviction action against a tenant residing in one of those properties for non-payment of rent. It did not mean that the tenant didn't owe the rent. It didn't provide for rent forgiveness. Although under the CARES Act, it did indicate that landlords couldn't charge late fees during that period of time. So the late fees were suspended, but the rent would continue to be owed after the moratorium ended. So that moratorium ended the end of July, around July 25th, July 26th. And there was no statewide moratorium in place. So it's really important to note there was a lot of confusion throughout the pandemic as to whether there was some eviction moratorium. The state of Ohio at no point ever issued an order ordering courts to stop hearing eviction cases. That never happened. And in fact, there were some courts that did continue to hear cases throughout the pandemic. It really varied from court to court. So pretty early on in the pandemic, those of us that worked with landlords and tenants decided it was really important to try to get the word out. So we created a website that still exists. It's mvcovid19eviction.com. That's mvcovid19eviction.com.
And so MV like Miami Valley.
Correct. COVID19eviction.com. And that was a one-stop shop. When courts were suspending eviction hearings, we were listing on there what courts were doing, when the Dayton Municipal Court stopped, when did they start back up, where can you get help? All of that information we placed on that website to try to help tenants and landlords sort of navigate this really difficult and uncertain time. And by, I would say by June of this year, courts in the Miami Valley had all begun hearing eviction cases. So, some began to suspend in March, and by June, they were all back up hearing eviction cases. So we had the CARES Act that came about that provided some protection for tenants in subsidized and public housing. But the reality is most renters throughout the nation don't have a subsidy helping them pay their rent. So there had been no protection for those tenants. On September 4th, 2020, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, issued a temporary halt on evictions. This was a nationwide order, just like the CARES Act was a piece of federal legislation that affected tenants nationwide. The CDC eviction moratorium also provided protections nationwide, but this time it provided protections to tenants in all types of housing, not just in subsidized and public housing.
Okay, that's an important distinction. It's an important point of clarification. Okay, what happened next?
So this order that was issued by the CDC on September 4th, 2020, said that tenants could invoke the protections under the order by filling out this form. It's called a declaration. And tenants would need to sign this declaration, and they would need to serve it on their landlord. And if they served it on their landlord, they could ask that their eviction be halted through the end of 2020, through December 31st, 2020. So right now that order is still in place. and tenants can complete that declaration. But there are a number of things, a number of items that the tenant has to attest to in order to submit that declaration to their landlord.
Okay. Do you want to talk about those? I'm looking at an article that I cut out. I think I mentioned this to you a few weeks back when we were talking. September 27, 2020, of the Dayton Daily News, page B, like in beautiful 3, page B3, which does I think, hopefully a good job of summarizing in a few paragraphs the steps a tenant has to take. But that may or may not be available online to people. So can people go to your website and see the specifics of how to address this? I don't think I heard that yet. I've been going back and forth listening and reading, but go ahead if you talk about some of the specifics there.
Yeah, so let me go through the specifics and then I can tell you where to find that information. So in order for a tenant to avail themselves of the protections under the CDC eviction moratorium, there are a number of items that they have to attest to. So there's this form, it's called a declaration, that the tenant would need to sign saying that they're answering truthfully. So the first is that they've used their best efforts to obtain assistance with their rent and or their housing. So in order to be protected under the CDC eviction moratorium, a tenant needs to have applied for rental assistance. If you're a tenant listening and you live in Montgomery County or Greene County or Preble County or Darke County, the place that you want to go to is the Miami Valley Community Action Partnership. They're the best place in the community to get rental assistance. They've been given the largest number of dollars to assist tenants. And the way you get there is you go to their website at www.mvcap.com. That's mvcap.com. If you go to their website, on the home page of the website, there'll be a big yellow box that says apply for assistance. That's where you want to start to apply for rental assistance. Also on that website, the same front page where there's this big yellow box that it says apply for assistance, on the other side, there's a number of links about the CDC eviction moratorium. And you could just click on, the links are blue. I'm actually looking at them right now to make sure I'm telling you the right thing. There's the eviction prevention declaration, that's what they call it. And there's one in a Word version where you can fill that out right on the website, or there's a PDF where you can print it out and fill it out. So I would encourage tenants to go to CAP's website. It's a one-stop shop for applying for rental assistance, which is a requirement under the declaration. And also at the same time, you can fill out the declaration.
Okay, now a couple questions that whenever you're talking, sometimes I'm here to just tweak a little and ask those questions that I'm hoping somebody's scratching their head and they're saying, okay, what if I don't have access to a cell phone or a computer? Can people still go to 719 South Main Street? I believe that might be CAP, the Community Action Partnership. They can go in and get a paper application. Can they do that also?
So they cannot, because CAP is closed to the public because of COVID-19.
Of course.
So they can apply online, or if you go to CAP's website, there's a phone number that you could call at the top, 937-341-5000. You could call, and I assume you could request a paper application through the mail. So just like CAP, the office I work for has been closed to the public since COVID hit, and so many staff are working remotely. There's also an email address on CAP's website, and I would imagine you could email them and request the paper app, but if you don't have a computer or a phone, yes, then the phone number would be the best way to do that.
Okay, and related to that then also is, are there any sites that you send people to who don't have access to a computer or to a phone? I believe the Wesley Community Center in West Dayton has provided computer services for free to folks who come in there. That's Wesley Community Center. It's at the corner of Oak Ridge and Delphus in West Dayton. I imagine that there may be other community centers out there that do similar or provide a similar service. Is there any other service, or are there any other services available where people might be able to go in and use a computer free to do this type of thing?
So we always encourage the public libraries. You'll have to watch for their hours given COVID when they're open. And then some housing sites have, computer rooms where you can access computers to get information. If you would contact our office for assistance, and if you need representation in an eviction case, you can contact our office. There's 2 ways to reach us. One is by phone, and that's 888-534-1432. Again, that's 888-534-1432. You can also get online if you have that option, and that's www.legalaidline.org. If you apply through us and you need a copy of the declaration, we'll mail you a copy. Obviously, there's concerns about mail. We've heard a lot in the news about delays with mail, and so we want to make sure that people, our tenants particularly, are going to be getting these documents in time that they're useful. So, being able to go to a library to print it out, if you're able to do that, or a community center might be the most, the quickest way to do things.
Excuse me. I mentioned the Wesley Center. I don't know for a fact that they are open, and they may have the same issues that you mentioned relative to your offices being closed and others. So I don't want to mislead people in that regard. So I would recommend anyone, if they're looking at going to a community center or one of these other resources or assistance, that they call ahead and see what the terms are for their being able to come in and get some information. Now, I believe that we have someone who has called in. Before I take this here, I want to say that I've gotten in my Zoom chat, there's a point that's been shared with me by the station that they will add websites and other numbers as needed when this episode of the program is edited. So that means that it will be available on DATV's YouTube station, and there will be additional information on the screen that we just cannot, we don't have the capacity, I guess, to put that on this evening. Okay, so normally we would put numbers up as we're going along, but I don't believe we can do that. If the folks at the station, if I misstated that or stated that incorrectly, feel free to send me another chat and I'll explain that. Now, we have a question from a caller, and it seems to be as follows. Does the back rent become due when the moratorium is over? And can they be evicted due to not paying back the back rent? And also, is the landlord allowed to charge interest, or do they absorb the loss? So let's start with the first question. Does the back rent become due when the moratorium is over? And can they be evicted due to not paying back the rent that's due, and possibly any other, I don't know if there would be any interest or any other damages that potentially the tenant could be obligated to pay? Let's start with that first.
Yeah, great question. So even though the CDC eviction moratorium suspended evictions, so long as the tenant meets the requirements under the act, which we'll get to those additional requirements, the moratorium does not waive the obligation of rent. So the rent is actually due when it's due under your lease. All the moratorium does is give the court the power to suspend the eviction until the end of the period, until after December 31st. So the landlord, if you would give your landlord a declaration and they would still file an eviction case, and the court found that you couldn't be evicted because of the moratorium, after the moratorium period is over with, so after December 31st, your landlord surely could go in and have you evicted for not paying that rent. This is why we really encourage tenants to work heavily with the places that have the rental assistance programs. And as I mentioned, one of the first requirements under the CDC eviction moratorium is that tenants need to avail themselves of rental assistance. Strongly encourage tenants to contact, in our area, Community Action Partnership to get access to those dollars, because many of those dollars will go away after December 31st of this year. So a lot of the money that has been made available is made available through the CARES Act, and much of that money needs to be spent by the end of the year. So it's really important to reach out and try to get that rental assistance to be able to pay your landlord and get current in your rent. The other piece I want to mention about that is that there is money available to not only pay back rent, but to pay rent through the end of the year. So if you have a tenant that, was behind a couple months in rent, CAP is often paying that, and then they'll pay oftentimes, like in this case, November and December to help the tenant get ahead.
And I'd like to address a little bit about where that money is coming from. There's money that it came to, in this instance, the county through the CARES Act, and also to the state of Ohio. Is that correct? And that money
correct. And so there's different dollars.
Different dollars, and both of these dollars right now through the CARE Act are at least locally being administered and utilized under the umbrella of the CAP, Community Action Partnership. Is that correct?
That's correct. There are other organizations that have smaller amounts of money, but by far the Miami Valley Community Action Partnership has the lion's share of the funds that are available to help tenants.
And furthermore, just to reiterate one point, particularly important point you made of many, the burden is on the tenant in these situations to do what the acts provide for. And if you don't do it, that money can be lost, and the landlords don't have an obligation then to take that money otherwise. An individual landlord may want to work with you, but if you don't work with them to get them paid, then the rent isn't going to get paid, and you're going to get evicted. Isn't that essentially the case? Once more. So, yeah. Okay.
As an advocate, what I would say is that the moratorium provided the space for landlords and tenants to be able to resolve many of these cases. The key to that is the rental assistance. So having those dollars available for the tenant and for the landlord is making a significant difference in many people's lives. And in my experience, what I'm often seeing is that landlords are willing to take that rental assistance that's now available. And I think the moratorium has really helped that.
Now, are willing to take the rental assistance, that suggests to me that are they willing to take sometimes less than what otherwise might be due for a given month, and then will that full month's obligation be fulfilled? Are they willing to take it when you say they're willing to take it the way it's provided in lieu of evicting the tenant, but they want the full amount for that month or those months that are being offered? What does that mean when you say that they'll do that? And I want to add also, I think for those who fear maybe talking to their landlords when they have this obligation or don't think they're going to get a response, the money is actually not going to pass into the hands of the tenant, as I understand. The tenant does its part, filling out the application, and the application is acceptable. CAP is the recipient of the funds, and they will see that it gets to the landlord. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So to answer your question,
the first question first or second, however you want.
So Ohio is not a pay-to-stay state. So something that is really difficult for tenants. And what I mean by that is in Ohio, if you are late on your rent, just one day late on your rent, your landlord can give you an eviction notice and start the eviction process. So when I say that landlords are willing to take the money, what I'm saying is that even though the rent is late, right, landlords are willing to take those funds from CAP to bring the tenant current. CAP is paying all that is owed. They're paying rent, they're paying late fees, and in some circumstances, they're also paying legal fees. So they're completely making the landlord whole. But the challenge that we saw prior to the moratorium is that landlords were not willing to take that money. They were still evicting tenants, even though that money was available. The moratorium, I think, provided the space to have those conversations and help keep tenants housed and help make the landlord whole. So the moratorium combined with the rental assistance is really the key. And I do want to mention that last Friday, Governor DeWine, along with lawmakers, announced a disbursement of CARES dollars to the counties. And there was a large disbursement, but of that, $55.2 million was designated for rental assistance, mortgage assistance, and water and sewer assistance. That money is expected to be sent to the local community action agencies, and that money will need to be spent by the end of the year.
Okay, which suggests, again, what you said earlier, that you may, as a tenant, be in a position to have multiple months of rent paid because the money is there, hopefully. It's always the issue of more rent due globally than what there are dollars to pay it. But for as long as that money lasts, now's the time to act so you can get as much or all of what you owe paid back and do it the right way, get CAP to pay it with the funds they've received, and hopefully the landlords will take this. I guess, again, the question that we also had is the landlord allowed to charge interest, or do they absorb that loss? Is still part of the answer we're going to address. And then I guess some people might say, well, why would a landlord go through the eviction if they could get the rent? I guess my first response might be that they want that tenant out for some reason, and this is a good basis for getting them out. And I don't know that's true, because I believe other folks, the landlords have obligations, they have payments to make, and I think in all fairness to create some sort of a level playing field here, they want to pay their bills, so they want to get paid. But I imagine there are some that just want the tenants out. Is that it?
Yeah, that's correct. So to get to the other question, is the landlord allowed to charge interest, or do they absorb the fees? Landlords can charge reasonable late fees. The city of Dayton passed a late fee ordinance in June of this year, capping late fees at 5% of the rental amount. So landlords can charge late fees. I mentioned earlier, under the CARES Act that President Trump signed into law at the end of March, that act that covered subsidized and public housing indicated that those landlords could not charge late fees during that 120-day eviction moratorium. That moratorium is gone, and so late fees can be charged, and the landlord could require that the tenant pay them. I should mention, though, that the late fee needs to be reasonable. And some cities have their own ordinance setting forth what is reasonable. I mentioned that Dayton set that as no more than 5%, but the courts definitely can weigh in on whether a late fee is reasonable.
Okay, and that's a little bit different than an interest charge, I would guess, depending on how it's styled, maybe in the lease agreement. But is there any difference, in fact, between an interest charge and a late fee for paying the rent late or not paying it at all? Is there a difference in this context?
I mean, I suppose you could think of it that way, kind of like if you own your house and you're paying a mortgage payment, you pay interest on that, but you pay that regardless of whether you pay it on time or you pay it late. A late fee is a fee that you get charged for paying your rent late.
Okay. And I guess you raised an issue there, talking about if you live in a house. We often, in our discussions, if for the most part, in fact, I think talked about folks who live in apartment buildings. And we don't always differentiate that the people who are impacted here live in a variety of types of places, rental houses, for one. I don't know if there are rental condos or this type of thing, maybe, where people might be eligible. I guess, when you get into government assistance, we haven't mentioned the fact that you have to be eligible based upon, to receive these government monies based upon where you sit on the poverty scale, right?
That's correct.
So you might want to mention that again, but it does impact upon a variety of renters in different situations. It may be one building with 2 tenants in it, it may be 4 tenants in the building, or it may be a much larger structure, I would imagine. But okay.
So if you don't mind, I'll go back to the declaration because we only got to one point.
Okay. Well, I probably admit to being guilty of interrupting you and getting you on a different track. I'm sorry.
Not at all.
There's so much information here.
As I mentioned, so in order to invoke the protections under the eviction moratorium that the CDC issued on September 4th, first you have to use your best efforts to obtain government, to get government assistance for your rent or your housing. So we talked about that and where you can apply. Secondly, you can't expect to earn more than $99,000 for calendar year 2020, or $198,000 if you're filing a joint return, or you received an economic impact payment, what we often call the stimulus payment that came out a few months ago. So that's the second point. The third is that you're unable to pay your full rent or to make a full payment due to substantial loss of income, and that's household income, so it could be yourself or another household member, loss of hours of work or wages, a layoff. So those are all the loss of money or extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expenses. And in order to say that you have extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expenses, you have to allege that you have unreimbursed medical expenses that are likely to exceed 7.5% of your adjusted gross income. So that's a defined term. It's very specific, whereas the loss of income or wages or hours is not specific. It's very vague. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is you have to indicate that you're using your best efforts to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as your circumstances may permit. So that doesn't mean that you have to be able to make payments. Just allege that you're trying to do the best that you can, depending on your circumstances, and everyone's circumstances are different. And then lastly, that if you were evicted, you would likely become homeless, or you would have to move into a property with someone else and live in close quarters. And so again, maybe I didn't say this, so I'm saying again, but the CDC eviction moratorium was really designed, it's a public health order. It's designed to keep people safe, to keep them in their home during this pandemic. And so that's why it's important that a piece of this is that you would either become homeless or you'd be forced to live with someone, which could potentially jeopardize your health during this pandemic.
And that's getting way back to the beginning when I talked about the map and how one point leads to another point and so forth. Maybe that's not a good metaphor there, but it's the idea that all these issues are interconnected, I guess, is the point I want to make. One writer wrote, let's suppose a single mom and her children get evicted. They now have no place to live. They have no reliable address where people can get in touch with them to help them in some way, or they can tell people you can reach me at this number, or you can reach me at this address if you're responding to some inquiry I've made. So then they go to the woman's mother, the grandma. And the grandma is elderly and has health issues, but the grandma doesn't want to turn them away. And so they end up at grandma's. Now, grandma's exposed potentially to COVID in a way that grandma might not have been before, but she isn't going to let them live on the street. And if they can come in under the terms of either grandma's owning her home or under a lease that she might be operating under, she's going to bring them in, and that raises whole new COVID issues, and on and on and on. And I'm sure you see that all the time, and that's and all sorts of issues. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but in terms of the impact that has upon where the children go to school, the meals they have each day or don't have, the health care they have or don't have, and so forth, right? Yeah, it's all interconnected. So I guess the import at this point is, of this last part of what you were saying is there's a vehicle in place for those who live in Montgomery County, at least, for getting your rent paid if you meet the threshold criteria. And I think it's hard for everyone to understand what those are, but that information is available on your website, right?
Yes, and it's also available on the CAP's website.
CAP's website, just to repeat that again. And I think if you just Google Community Action Partnership Dayton, Ohio, that will get you where you need to go to get to their website and to follow the prompts there. And again, for the website where Deb works, again, you want to repeat that, Deb?
So in order to apply for services, you want to go to our legal aid line website, which is www.legalaidline.org.
Okay. And what if you just want to go and read on the website the details that you've been discussing here? Same website, same information? You mentioned another website earlier.
So I would encourage, if you want information about the declaration, because I know for folks this is a stressful time. Yeah. If you just go to CAP's website, the front page has both the rental assistance tab, and it also has information on the declaration, and that's www.mvcap, so it's Miami Valley Community Action Partnership.com. Just a note for rental assistance purposes, they do cover Montgomery County, but they also cover Greene and Preble and Darke counties. So 4-county service area, you can apply on there for rental assistance. You can also get your declaration on there at the same time.
And one thing too, you alluded to this earlier, but I don't think we talked a lot about it. You can be getting not only rental assistance, but potentially utility assistance. Is that correct?
That's correct. That is correct. So they are assisting with utilities as well. And we haven't really talked about that. I think I mentioned briefly that early on in the pandemic, many cities ceased the shutoff of water. Dayton was one of them. And many utility companies, electric companies like DP&L stopped, the cessation of electric, same with natural gas. Most communities have now allowed those shutoffs to resume. So even if they have it, many tenants have significant balances that are owed. So there's a need to get those balances paid. I did want to mention that I saw this and I forgot about this, that Montgomery County, separate from the CAP office, has CARES dollars to help tenants and I think homeowners with their utilities.
That's a long-standing. Pardon me. That's a long-standing part of their mission, in fact. That they have funds to help with heating problems during the winter and that type of thing, right?
Right. So what I'm talking about is Montgomery County has CARES dollars not through CAP, but separate through CAP to with utilities. And I will get that, I'll look that up while we're talking, but I'll get that information to share as well.
Okay. Now, we don't have to talk about this necessarily at this moment. We have probably about 15 minutes remaining. But I want to talk about some of the retaliatory stories that are being told. I don't know how accurate they are. If they're more urban legend, I'd rather we get that understood. If this is happening, people need to know how to deal with it. And related to that is, when in these circumstances, while the moratoriums are in place, what role can you play directly as attorneys, and what, as opposed to folks acting on their own potentially to get these forms, fill out the applications without legal assistance, or if they find they can't, can they get legal assistance to fill out these forms?
So if you're a tenant and you're behind in your rent, and you're not sure what to do, or you've gotten a declaration form and you're still not sure what to do, you can contact our office for assistance. We can walk you through the process and advise you as to the steps. It's really important that you read the declaration and you only sign it if you can answer truthfully, because there are penalties that can be assessed to you if you lie. And one of the callers asked about whether or not they still owe rent. And right on the declaration form, it does indicate that you still have to pay rent, and you have to comply with your obligations under the lease, that the landlord can still charge fees and penalties for not paying rent, and basically that those costs don't go away. This is a moratorium on you being evicted. It's not a forgiveness of your rent or your late fees. And that's why it's so important for tenants to contact Community Action Partnership to get assistance. What we're seeing happening with these declarations is that when a tenant is given, when they're served with an eviction complaint, so, the landlord has filed court papers to start an eviction process, and then the tenant completes this declaration and serves it on their landlord. We are seeing landlords asking for hearings to question tenants about these declarations, to basically question whether they're answering truthfully. We're representing tenants in those hearings. So you should contact our office for assistance. Again, you can do that by calling us at 888-534-1432, or you can apply online at www.legalaidline.org.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I've read about different reports, and not necessarily all locally, but across the country, that landlords, some of the things that they allegedly are doing here. And I wondered how factual they'd be. It seemed to me it's counterintuitive that they would not want to get their rental monies paid, that if they pay the utilities, that they would want the money to include money for the utilities. But it seemed in some instances, as I suggested earlier, landlords want somebody out, and that's more important than getting them out of that unit and getting somebody else back in than keeping them there. I hope that's the minority of cases. And I know that there are cases where the tenants have not fulfilled the terms of their leases, and that's why the landlords want them out, aside from the rent. Just in a sense, in an effort to be fair about these things here. So I guess that's for the courts to decide as to what the factual scenario is and what the law is going to apply here. But I guess I wanted to address that because I don't think people should give up if they hear that some bad things are happening, or they hear stories about somebody else's situation. Everyone's situation is a little bit different. So try your best, I guess, is what I'm encouraging people to do when they take all this information into consideration, is to follow the steps that have been made available for them, and maybe they'll be able to get some of the relief that hopefully is being provided and is available to them. And don't get discouraged. And when you call up, I guess I want to say that when you call, if you're not sure that you're the best person to listen to what's being said, either by someone at your legal aid line or whoever they're calling at CAP, or whatever agency they're working with in some regard, have somebody there with you to help you. For one reason or another, you may be hard of hearing, English may not be your original language, any of these kinds of things. So have somebody there that can help you get through this process so you don't get further frustrated. And you also have folks who are bilingual to take calls, do you not?
We do, and we also use interpreter services. So regardless of language, we have the ability to be able to talk with folks. So please call us if you need help. I did want to circle back on the utility issue. I was able to find the information that I was looking for. So the Montgomery County CARES office has money available to help with utility bill credit. So in order to avail yourself of this, you have to live in Montgomery County, you have to be a DP&L or a veteran customer, the address has to be Montgomery County, you have to have a balance of at least 30 days past due, and the credits will cover charges billed on or after March 1st.
Let me interrupt you. We probably have less than 5 minutes, they're telling me. Can you repeat that contact point where people can get the information you're providing now? And then I'll ask you if there's any one last point or two in that less than 5 minutes that you want to make before we're off the air. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this veteran and DP&L assistance, this is not through our office, but it's through the Montgomery County CARES office, and that's at mcohiocares.org.
That's CARES.org.
Yes, okay. So www.mcohiocares.org.
Okay. There's a lot more to this subject matter, but I think we've hit on some of the really important immediate points here tonight. I can't thank you enough. Is there anything else that you want to put a fine point on or add in the minute or two we have remaining?
I want to mention, this is the first time in my legal career that I've seen a significant influx of rental assistance that's been made available to tenants. Most tenants in the past, if they get behind in their rent, they don't bother showing up for their eviction hearing because they think they're going to be evicted. It's different now. There's the CDC eviction moratorium. There's rental assistance available. So there are options to keep tenants housed. So I just want to tell tenants, reach out to us if you have questions. Reach out to CAP for rental assistance. Reach out to the county for utility assistance. There's money available to help keep people where they are and to keep them safe.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay, well, I think we've covered everything. I haven't been told that we're out of time specifically, but I hope that this has been of help to folks. Please, again, you can access this show. It'll probably be available in the next 24 to 48 hours, 72, I guess, at the latest, by going to DATV and go to their website. You'll see where you can get on their YouTube site and get this show and hear all this fine information that Deb has provided. I thank you, Deb. I really appreciate it so much. This is the third year that I've been doing this, the third year you've kicked off the year for us, and it's just wonderful to have you with us and to get this information. I hope we can help as many people as possible by providing this. I just said 2 minutes remaining. Anything else you want to add at this point? I believe taking it up to the last second if we can. I guess there's still a certain degree of uncertainty as to what's going to happen next before the end of the year, as far as whether any additional money will be available, whether or not there'll be any extension. But I guess the flip of that is don't wait. Try to be hopeful, but don't wait and lose your opportunity. It could be that you get your back rent paid and maybe there'll be some additional rent available going forward. Because surely people have lost jobs, people have found a difficult time to get a job when they don't have stable housing. And so again, this all spills over one issue into another. So please, everybody who's listening to this, you know somebody in this situation, if you're not sure you're eligible, look into it and find out. Don't just give up, okay? And keep going and keep paying attention to the news, however you get your news, and see what the latest is. And if you're not sure it applies to you in Dayton, Ohio, or Montgomery County, do a little bit more research or call one of the organizations that Deb has mentioned this evening to get answers to your questions. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me on, Jeff. I hope this information's been helpful.
It's been wonderful. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and tell your friends about us, and hopefully we'll see you sometime in November for another program. It's Jeff Swillinger saying good night. Be healthy and be safe. Thank you.